The trunk rattled inside even before I could turn off the engine, dry, heavy, as if someone had thrown their body against the metal wall. It wasn't a moving load. I recognized that sound. It came with a pause, then another impact, at the same point, as if someone were measuring force. I kept my hand on the ignition without turning it off because the whole truck went quiet too quickly after the second impact. I looked at the seal in the mirror and it was there but turned the wrong way, as if it had been closed in a hurry. When the third impact came, weaker and more drawn out, it became clear that it wasn't something loose inside trying to settle down. I was in a small yard in Alabama, one of those that doesn't have a constant flow of people. Trucks only enter when there's cargo to be moved, and at that hour there was almost no one around. The lighting came from two tall poles at the back, leaving the rest of the yard somewhat uneven, with areas that were too bright and others where the trailer practically disappeared depending on the angle. I had just pulled over to wait for the next shipment to be released. A quick thing, at least that's what they'd told me before I went in. The problem is that this type of cargo came sealed from the source, and we don't tamper with that without direct authorization, especially inside a yard with a supervisor present. Even so, that sound didn't match anything I'd ever heard coming from sealed cargo, and the way it stopped after the last impact didn't seem natural. I got out of the cab more slowly than usual, without slamming the door, just to see if I could hear it again with the engine off and without any vibration. The ground had some old oil stains and stagnant water reflecting light from the streetlights, so any movement made shadows move before I could even see what it was. I stood still for a few seconds near the rear wheel, trying to pick up any other sound coming from inside the cargo area, but only the wind passing by the sides. When I started walking toward the door, the metal made that slight cracking sound of expansion, which is common, but there it seemed too out of place. And even without any noise coming from inside, the feeling wasn't of an empty cargo area or stationary load. It was of something being contained. The seal was intact but loose enough to twist with my finger, something that shouldn't happen after a trip of that length. I pulled it just enough without breaking it, and it snapped back into place on its own. But it wasn't aligned with the fitting as it should be. Normally it comes snug, almost locked, and that one seemed to have been closed without full pressure. I looked around for someone in the yard, but there was only a truck parked further away, with no one visible in the cab. And even with everything quiet, the cargo box seemed too heavy for the type of load listed on the document. I went back to the front of the truck as if to get something from the cab, more to observe the yard from a different angle without it seeming like I was checking the cargo. The office was in a low building near the gate, with a bright white light on inside, but you couldn't see anyone moving. The radio was on in the cab low, and when I opened the door, the sound seemed too loud compared to the silence outside. I turned it off immediately, because any small noise started to seem out of place in that environment. And the quieter it got, the more that first impact came back to my head, repeating itself in the same way. I'd seen poorly secured cargo before, heard drums banging, pallets coming loose, even animals being transported improperly. But this didn't fit into any of those categories. The interval between the impacts wasn't random, and the last one came with a dragging sound as if there was less force behind it. I stood there leaning against the side of the truck, doing nothing for a few seconds, trying to decide whether to ignore it and follow protocol. But ignoring it meant leaving with something wrong happening inside my own trailer. And the worst part wasn't the noise. It was the fact that it had now stopped completely. I went straight to the back of the trailer before anyone showed up in the yard, without thinking much beyond the basics of not leaving it closed. The seal gave way too easily when I pulled, almost without resistance, which didn't make sense after a long trip with supposedly intact cargo. I held it in my hand for a second, looking at the marked plastic as if trying to decide if I could still go back. But after that last impact, ignoring it was no longer an option. I carefully pulled the door latch, trying not to make a loud metallic noise that would attract attention. The door opened a few inches at first, strangely stuck from the inside, as if something were pressing against it. I forced it a little more, and felt the resistance suddenly give way, causing the door to open too quickly at the end of the movement. The air that came out wasn't the smell of cargo. It was hot, heavy, with a kind of dampness that didn't match normal transport. I stopped before opening it completely, looking through the crack first because something was already too wrong to continue automatically. And even with only a small opening, You could feel movement inside. When I pulled open the other door, the space opened just enough to see the first face, and he didn't react with surprise. He reacted like someone expecting it to happen. There were people tied up on the floor side by side, occupying almost the entire usable length of the trailer. Some trying to move, but unable to. The outside light didn't reach inside properly, but enough to see that it wasn't just one person. There were several. One of them tried to lift his head when the door opened further but couldn't hold it up. And nobody made a loud noise, which only made everything seem more wrong. I stepped inside without realizing it, just enough to get a better look, trying to understand how many people were there and what condition they were in. The metal floor was too hot for the time of day, as if the truck had been closed for too long without ventilation. Some had their hands tied behind their backs, others only had tape over their mouths, but all with the same direct gaze, waiting for some reaction from me. And the space that should have been occupied by cargo was completely empty except for them. There were no pallets, no securing, nothing to justify that transport. That's when I heard the sound of the office door opening behind me, dry, unhurried, like someone who already knew exactly where I was. I didn't turn around immediately, but the reflection in the metal of the door already showed movement coming towards me. And before I could decide whether to close the chest again or call someone, the feeling changed too quickly for doubt, because at that moment it became clear that opening that door hadn't been an operational error. It had been exactly what someone expected me to do. He didn't even look directly inside the trunk when he came up behind me, only stopping close enough to speak before I could react. His voice was low, controlled, as if he didn't want to draw attention, but he also didn't seem worried about what I had seen. He said I shouldn't have opened it without permission, even knowing that I couldn't ignore what was happening inside after that. When I turned my head, he was already closer than he should have been, showing no surprise, asking nothing, just confirming that he had been controlling everything since before I arrived. I tried to say something, but nothing that made sense came out at the moment, because looking back inside the truck only made everything clearer. There were more people than I had counted at first glance, some trying to move when they noticed his presence as well. And the way he positioned himself between me and the trailer's exit wasn't accidental. It was calculated enough to close the space without seeming like a sudden movement. Behind him, the yard remained too empty for that type of operation, and the truck furthest away continued on with no sign of anyone in the cab, as if it were just there to fill space. He placed his hand on the trunk door as if to help close it, but didn't apply any force yet, just left it there, waiting for some reaction from me. He said it wasn't my problem, that I could still get out of there without any trouble if I did it the right way. But the way he spoke left no real choice, because his position already cut off any clean exit. And when one of those on the floor tried to crawl a few inches towards the light, he pushed the door a little further, narrowing the opening without taking his eyes off me. He didn't raise his voice or make any sudden movements, just tilted his head toward the inside of the trunk, as if it had already been decided before I even opened the door. He told me to go inside and help organize things using an almost operational tone, as if it were part of the job. I stood still for a second longer than I should have, and that was enough for him to take half a step forward, closing the distance without touching me. He didn't have a visible weapon, but I also had no doubt that this wasn't a suggestion, and behind him, the courtyard remained too quiet for anyone to hear anything. When I climbed into the trailer, the hot floor rushed straight past the soles of my boots, and the air inside felt heavier than before, as if there was less room to breathe. As soon as I was completely inside, he pulled the door shut with a movement far too quick for the pace he had been maintaining until then, closing it before I could react. The metallic impact was sharp, and the sound of the padlock outside followed immediately, without hesitation. The only light that remained was that which filtered through the tiny cracks in the doors, cutting through the darkness in thin lines that illuminated almost nothing. Inside, the space completely changed size when the door closed, because now there was no visible exit, only the mass of people occupying the floor. One of those closest tried to say something through the tape, but only a muffled, short, weak sound came out. I took a step back reflexively, but there was nowhere to go without bumping into someone. And that's when it became clear that the mistake hadn't been opening the trunk. The mistake had been believing that it was still possible to get out of there after that. The truck started moving without warning. First a slight jolt, then continuous acceleration that made everyone slide a few inches on the metal floor. Nobody screamed loudly, just that muffled sound of effort and contained pain because most didn't even have room to react properly. I tried to lean against the side, but the cargo box had no useful fixed point, just a smooth, hot surface that didn't help at all. Every small turn caused the weight inside the trailer to shift, pressing down on those already on the ground without the strength to protect themselves. And the worst part was knowing that this wasn't improvised, it was a transport that had been done before. The air started to become harder to draw after a few minutes, not due to a total lack of oxygen, but from a mixture of heat, sweat, and lack of real ventilation. One of the guys closest tried to kick the door, weakly, repeatedly, without enough rhythm to attract attention from outside. I tried to help, but the space didn't allow me to gain enough force to make a useful noise. And even when the impact was a little louder, the truck didn't slow down, didn't swerve, didn't react in any way. That only confirmed that whoever was driving knew exactly what was behind them. I lost exact track of how much time had passed, but the body starts reacting before the mind when the environment doesn't change. Some were practically motionless, others trying to keep their eyes open just to avoid passing out right there. I tried to control my breathing, leaning against the door, searching for any larger crack of air, but there was nothing but thin lines of light. And inside there was no longer any doubt about what was happening. The only thing that was still unclear was how far it would go. The truck stopped with a harder brake than usual, throwing everyone forward at once, and before anyone could react, the doors opened, direct light streaming in from outside. It wasn't ordinary yard lighting. It was an excessively bright white light coming from more than one point at once, cutting cleanly through the darkness of the truck bed. I instinctively raised my arm, and the silhouettes that appeared didn't have the posture of those who belonged there. Their movements were quick, coordinated without hesitation. Nobody screamed. Nobody wasted time, just people getting in and pulling the first bodies out as if they already knew exactly what they were going to find inside. I was pulled along afterward, somewhat dazed, my legs slow to respond outside that cramped space, and that's when I saw the supervisor further back, already restrained without resistance, as if he'd been caught out of control. He didn't look at me, nor did he try to justify anything. He just stood there while someone spoke to him without raising their voice. The yard, which had been empty before, was now too busy. Vehicles, lights, people occupying every spot where there had been no one before. And the truck I had parked minutes before was no longer just a vehicle. It had become evidence. After that came the procedure, the repeated question, the signature, the waiting, and a sequence of things that no longer depended on me to continue. I didn't go back on the road that day, nor the next. And when I did, I no longer accepted sealed cargo without checking it first, even when the paperwork says everything is fine. It's not an official rule. It's something that sticks after you understand how it got there without anyone stopping first. Because after that day, the problem stopped being the noise inside the truck bed. It became when there's no noise at all. If you're enjoying the story so far, consider subscribing to the channel and leaving a like. And tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. It really helps the YouTube algorithm show these stories to more people. The light hit the dashboard out of nowhere, too bright to be a reflection, and remained stationary while the rest of the cabin stayed dark. I glanced quickly in the rearview mirror, thinking it was a car too close, but there wasn't anyone near enough to shine that light like that. When I looked up a little through the windshield, I could see that it wasn't coming from the road, it was coming from above, outside the normal beam of the headlights. The buzzing sound appeared soon after, low and constant, like equipment working too close to the cabin. And when the light dimmed a little, becoming more direct on the glass, it became clear that it wasn't just passing by. I was driving through a quieter stretch of Texas, one of those where you can go miles without seeing anyone, just a straight line and road signs too spaced out to provide any consistent reference. The cab was stable, cruising speed normal, nothing out of the ordinary until that light appeared. That type of route doesn't usually have that kind of low-altitude air traffic, much less something following a vehicle at the same speed. Even so, at first, I tried to interpret it as some kind of road inspection or monitoring equipment. but it made absolutely no sense that it was so low and aligned exactly with the truck. The light lowered a few feet and became more direct on the windshield, strong enough to begin to obstruct my view of the road ahead. It wasn't intermittent. It didn't vary like a car's headlights on uneven terrain. It was too steady, as if it were being held manually above me. The buzzing became more present inside the cabin, not loud, but constant enough to be unignorable. I slightly adjusted my position on the steering wheel, more out of reflex than necessity, trying to see if it would react to any change in my direction. And it did, maintaining exactly the same distance and angle, as if it were locked onto the truck. I looked again in the side mirrors, searching for any vehicle that might be coordinating this. But there was no supporting light, no shadow approaching, nothing to indicate an immediate presence on the road. The shoulder was clear, no cars stopped, no movement on the edges. Even so, the feeling wasn't of being alone on the road, but of being followed without a visible point of origin. The dashboard began to reflect more white light than usual, making some indicators less clear depending on the angle. And the more I tried to ignore it, the more present it remained. I slowed down a bit to see if the object would pass by or move away, but it adjusted accordingly, maintaining its relative position without apparent effort. This already removed any doubt that it wasn't something random crossing the airspace. The cabin started to feel uncomfortable, not because of the heat, but because of the constant light directly in my field of vision. Blinking didn't help, changing the focus didn't either, because it wouldn't budge. And the buzzing, even though faint, had become part of the environment, as if it had been there much longer than it actually had. That's when I thought about trying to react somehow, not because I understood what it was, but because I couldn't accept continuing to drive with something stuck to the truck like that. It wasn't standard procedure. It wasn't company policy. It was a spur-of-the-moment decision, based more on discomfort than on sound logic. But any decision made there would already be too late for whoever was controlling it. Because if it was following me like that, it had already started before I even realized it. I reached for the flashlight in the door compartment without taking the truck out of its lane, only diverting my gaze from the road as little as possible. It wasn't equipment made for that. It was a regular cab flashlight, but bright enough to illuminate well ahead during a night inspection. I rested it on the steering wheel for a second just to adjust the angle and raised it directly towards the light coming from above. I didn't think about protocol. I didn't think about consequences, only about the idea of breaking that fixed point that was following me. And the moment the flashlight's beam hit the object, the buzzing changed instantly. It didn't get any higher. It became more tense, erratic, as if it had changed mode, and the white light coming from above widened slightly, spreading across the windshield before refocusing directly. I kept the flashlight pointed for a few more seconds, trying to force a clearer reaction, but the effect wasn't what I expected. Instead of moving away, the object descended a few more feet, approaching the top of the cab, making the sound more present inside the truck. The road remained empty, but now the sensation was no longer one of being followed, but of a direct response to what I had done. That's when visibility really started to worsen, not just because of the light, but because of something that began to spread across the glass coming from top to bottom. First it looked like condensation, then it turned into a thin layer that distorted everything in front, as if there was an irregular film on the windshield. I tried to activate the wipers, but it only dragged it along without really cleaning, spreading it even more. And at that point, it became clear that pointing the flashlight hadn't just been a reaction. It had been the trigger for something that was already ready to happen. Visibility dropped too quickly after that film spread across the windshield, and lights started appearing on the sides before I could even clean it properly. They weren't headlights, they were shapes moving parallel to the truck, appearing and disappearing at the edge of my field of vision. I pulled the steering wheel slightly to stay in my lane, trying not to react abruptly without knowing exactly what was around me. The hum continued above the cab, steady, as if nothing had changed for whoever was controlling it. And the more I tried to focus on the road, the more things started appearing off it. One of the vehicles approached from the right without any lights, just a dark silhouette following the truck's rhythm, too aligned to be a coincidence. On the left, another similar movement, maintaining enough distance not to touch, but too close to ignore. I tried to slow down, but they adjusted as well, maintaining the same relative positioning as the drone had already been doing. The cabin began to feel cramped, not physically but due to the lack of reaction space, as if every decision I made had already been foreseen before I made it. And the road, which had previously been empty, now seemed occupied without needing visible traffic. The windshield wipers kept passing by without solving the problem, only pushing that thin layer that distorted everything ahead, creating areas where the road seemed displaced a few inches from its actual position. I tried opening the window a little to clean manually, but the air that came in made the buzzing even more noticeable, louder than it had seemed with everything closed. And even then, I couldn't see the drone directly, only the light and the effect it caused. The vehicles alongside began to line up further ahead, closing the gap without making any abrupt movements, just progressively occupying their positions. And at that point, it was no longer possible to treat it as mere surveillance. That's when I realized there was no clear way out ahead, not because there was a complete blockage yet, but because the space was being gradually taken over, with no real opening to accelerate or swerve. I thought about forcing my way through, but without full visibility and with vehicles on both sides, any mistake there would mean total loss instantly. The truck continued to respond normally, but the surrounding environment was no longer controllable by me. And the drone was still there, in exactly the same relative position, as if everything had been synchronized with it from the beginning. The impact on the roof was dry, metallic, strong enough to vibrate the entire cab at once, and it wasn't something loose from the road, it came from above. I reflexively looked up, but the light was still there, glued to my field of vision, obscuring any direct shape. The truck maintained its line for a few seconds after that, and then came another sound, more drawn out, like weight shifting across the surface of the trailer. It didn't make sense in motion, not at that speed, not with something managing to stay up there. Before I could react properly, a heavier noise came from the top of the cabin, followed by a short crack, and something began to give way above me. It didn't open all at once. It was pressure first, then rupture, as if they knew exactly where to apply force. Small fragments fell inside the cabin along with dust and cooler air from outside, and when the opening was large enough, a shadow descended directly through it without hesitation, already positioned to enter the space before I could even take my hands off the steering wheel. I tried to correct the truck at the same time because the road was already compromised and any second without control would make everything worse, but I couldn't do both. Being inside the cab completely changed the situation. It wasn't about steering anymore. It was about surviving in that space that had been invaded. The steering wheel pulled slightly to the left when I lost alignment for a moment, and that was enough to take the truck off the clear trajectory. And that was the end of any chance of getting out of that situation without real damage. The truck veered off course in seconds, first drifting a few feet out of the lane, then losing traction completely as the entire weight began to pull to the wrong side. I still tried to correct with the steering wheel, but it was no longer a clean response, just a delayed reaction from the shifting mass. The side hit the uneven shoulder, and that was enough to initiate the rollover, slow at first, heavy, irreversible. The sound of the missing cargo was non-existent, but the weight of the vehicle itself was enough to take everything with it. And when the truck finally flipped over, the impact was sharp, compressing the space before stopping. Inside the cabin, everything shifted position at once, and it takes a while for the body to adjust when the world turns upside down like that. I slammed against the door and then against the seat, strapped in by the seatbelt, with the air escaping faster than it entered. Silence followed immediately after the impact, but it wasn't complete. There was still a cracking sound, like the structure settling after the twisting. The opening in the roof let in air and dust, and the drone's light was no longer in the same spot. But the buzzing sound lingered for a few seconds, more distant, as if it were fading away after everything had already happened. When I managed to free myself, the cabin was tilted, making it difficult to move without slipping on everything that had shifted. Outside, I started hearing movement, quick footsteps, a door being forced open, but it wasn't an immediate rescue. It was people coming straight to the truck before anything else. They didn't try to get me out first. They went to the trailer, opening access to whatever was still usable back there. And even without seeing everything, I could understand that the truck was never their objective. I was just in the way between them and the cargo. When the movement stopped, the silence returned far too quickly for an accident of that magnitude, as if nothing had happened there just minutes before. I spent a few seconds trying to understand if anyone was still nearby, but there was no engine sound, no door slamming, no voice, only the wind passing through the open metal. The truck was on its side, stuck in that strange angle that the body takes a while to accept as its final position, and the road, which before seemed controlled by them, was now empty again, as if it had been returned to normal. I managed to get out of the cabin with difficulty, sliding on the bent metal and supporting myself wherever I could, more by instinct than by organized force. Outside, there was no clear trace of who had been there, only scattered marks on the asphalt and the shoulder, nothing that explained the number of people involved. The trailer was already open, and what remained inside wasn't enough to justify the risk they had taken. They didn't stay even a second longer than necessary, just the exact time to grab what they wanted and leave, and that was clearer than anything else. Then came the police, the report, the insurance company, everything on their timeline, not mine. The truck was a total loss, the cargo too, and the incident was filed as just another difficult case to fully close. I went back on the road after that, but I never again considered an empty road synonymous with safety, because there was no long chase, no exchanging of mistakes, no chance to negotiate anything. It was a clean execution, and when it was over, there was no one left to explain. The GPS indicated a right turn that I almost missed because it didn't look like an entrance to anything, just a stretch of gravel cutting across the side of the road. I reduced the distance more out of doubt than confidence, and when the route recalculated, it maintained exactly the same instruction, without suggesting an alternative. The road ahead was already somewhat enclosed by trees on both sides, and it was impossible to see how far it extended, or if there was room to maneuver afterward. I glanced quickly in the mirror to make sure I could turn around if it was a mistake, but it no longer seemed so simple to make a U-turn with the trailer there. As I walked through the gate, it began to close before I had even finished entering. The gate slammed shut behind me with a dry, metallic sound, and I still moved forward a few feet before truly processing that it shouldn't have happened that way. It wasn't an automatic gate like in a condominium, nor a lightweight farm gate. It was heavy, too perfectly aligned, closing without hesitation. I looked in the mirror expecting to see someone operating it, but there was no movement near the entrance. The GPS remained active as if nothing were wrong, maintaining the forward route, and the space I had to turn back no longer seemed viable with the trailer at that angle. The gravel road was narrow, with fences on both sides and trees blocking it further ahead, obscuring any sense of depth. The truck's headlights hit the uneven ground, kicking up light dust, but there were no recent signs of heavy traffic. It wasn't an entrance frequently used by a truck of that size. That was easy to tell from the width and lack of wear on the sides. Even so, the route didn't recalculate, didn't suggest an exit, just told me to keep going. And the slower I advanced, the more the road seemed to push me inward with no clear way back. The house started to appear more clearly after a few seconds, but not as a stopping point, more as a fixed landmark at the back of the property. Low light, no visible movement, no vehicles parked outside to justify that active entry. I looked for any delivery sign, license plate, number, anything that connected it to a real destination. There was none, and yet the GPS continued to indicate that I was on the right track. I thought about stopping right there and trying to maneuver back, but the space was already too tight, and the type of terrain didn't favor a quick attempt without risking locking up the vehicle. The steering wheel responded normally, the truck was under control, but the surrounding environment offered no margin for error. The gate behind was no longer visible in the mirror due to the angle and distance. Only the fence line and darkness beyond it remained. And at that point, turning back wasn't as simple as it had seemed a few seconds before. What was strange wasn't just the entrance. It was the fact that nothing there reacted to the truck's presence. No lights turning on, no dogs, no sounds coming from the house. Nothing to indicate that anyone noticed a vehicle of that size entering the property. Just the engine, the gravel under the wheels, and the GPS insisting on the same direction. And the further I went, the more it seemed I had already passed the point where I could still treat it as a common mistake. I continued for a few more feet, keeping the truck aligned in the center of the gravel, more out of a sense of wanting to finish the journey than out of genuine trust in the GPS. The house grew larger in the windshield, but without gaining any detail, as if the light there didn't properly reach what was around it. The GPS didn't recalculate, didn't freeze, it just maintained the instruction to continue as if it were a regular destination. I had already passed the comfortable point of turning back, so the decision became to continue until I found a better space to maneuver. And at that moment, it seemed safer to go to the end than to try to turn back halfway. As I got closer, I could see that the area in front of the house wasn't exactly a yard. It was just an irregular open space with no parking markings, no indication of a loading dock, nothing that would justify a loading stop. I slowed down even more, almost stopping, trying to figure out if there was any side access or unloading point that wasn't visible from afar. The headlights illuminated parts of the facade but showed no movement, no shadows passing by, no sign of people waiting. And yet, the route remained active, as if that were still the correct spot. That's when I felt the truck sink a little deeper into the ground than it should have, with the gravel becoming looser under the wheels, making the vehicle less stable. I thought about stopping right there and reversing, but the limited lateral space was already a problem, and any mistake there could leave the trailer stuck. The engine remained stable. Everything was working normally, but the environment no longer seemed to respond like a typical delivery. And the slower I moved forward, the clearer it became that I wasn't arriving at a destination. I was entering it. Before I came to a complete stop, a second gate closed further ahead, aligned with the house, cutting off the only open space that still seemed like an exit. It wasn't quick or noisy. It was firm, continuous, as if someone were controlling the movement without haste. I was left with the truck practically stopped in the middle of the property, with no real space to move forward and no safe way to turn back. The GPS remained on, still indicating that I had arrived at my destination, as if that were correct. And the silence around me only made it clearer that this was no coincidence. I engaged reverse anyway, just to test if I still had room to maneuver, but the loose gravel began to give way slightly under the weight, cutting traction before I could properly align myself. It wasn't completely stuck, but it was enough to prevent clean and quick movement. I adjusted the steering wheel trying to regain the angle, but the lateral space didn't help, and the fence on both sides didn't allow any mistake to go unpunished. The truck responded, but not with the precision I needed at that moment. And at that point, it was no longer possible to treat it as a route error. That's when I noticed movement outside the direct range of the spotlight, first as a shadow breaking the outline of the fence, then as a shape moving without fully entering the light. It wasn't just one person. You could tell by the different rhythm of movement in more than one spot. Nobody ran, nobody spoke loudly. They just positioned themselves gradually, occupying space without haste. The house remained dimly lit, with no doors opened, no indication of who was inside, and that removed any doubt that I wasn't alone there. I turned off the high beams for a second to try and see better what was outside the direct light, but that only worsened my sense of direction. When I turned them back on, the positions had shifted a few feet, closer together, still outside the center of the illumination. The truck was running, but stopped, and any attempt to get out of there now depended on reactions that were too quick for such a limited space. And the decision-making time was no longer mine, because whoever was out there wasn't improvising anything. He entered the lighthouse slowly, coming from the front of the truck, and stopped close enough for me to see his face, but not close enough for me to react beforehand. He climbed onto the cab step as if he'd done it before, gripping the side handle firmly without hesitation. In his other hand, a small saw already running, its sound low but constant, too out of place in that silence. He didn't say anything, didn't make a sign, just stood there, tall enough to look directly into the cab. And behind him, other shadows continued to move, occupying space without fully entering the light. I froze for a second, trying to decide whether to start the truck or open the door, but neither option was clear at that point. The space ahead was closed, the terrain didn't help with traction, and any sudden movement there could make things worse. He took a step higher on the step, bringing his face closer to the window, without changing his expression, as if assessing his reaction time. The chainsaw was still running, not touching anything yet, just maintaining that constant sound inside the cab. And it was at that moment that it became clear that this wasn't a threat meant to scare us. It was procedure. When he brought the blade closer to the door without touching it yet, the message was complete without needing a single word. I pulled my seatbelt at once and opened the door before he could even touch it, because any delay there would only make things worse. The gravel floor gave way slightly as I stepped out, and before I could take 2 full steps, people were already positioned on both sides, closing the gap without running. The truck was behind me, still running, but already out of the equation. And at that point, there was no possible decision that could change what was going to happen. I ran without a defined direction, simply choosing the point on the fence that seemed lowest, even with the uneven terrain pulling my foot with each step. The loose gravel didn't help, and my boot slipped slightly with each push, slowing me down before I could gain any real distance. Behind me, nobody shouted, nobody ran haphazardly, just coordinated movement closing the gaps on the sides. I felt the approach before I saw it because the sound of the ground changed with more than one step coming at the same pace. And when I got close to the fence, I realized it wasn't just the time that was the problem. It was the reinforced structure that didn't give way easily. I tried to climb anyway, using my own momentum to gain the first few feet. But the wire gave way slightly and snapped back forcefully, throwing me off balance before I could shift my body weight. My hand scraped against the metal and lost its grip, and the impact on the return was sharp, directly hitting my shoulder and side. Before I could stand up again, there were already people close enough to prevent any second attempt. It wasn't an uncontrolled strike. It was a quick, direct hold, eliminating any room for reaction without prolonging it. And that was the end of the part where running was still an option. When they lifted me up, it wasn't rushed. It was controlled, like they already knew exactly what to do with anyone trying to leave the perimeter. The truck stayed where it was, running, lights on, pointing into the void, completely out of place at that point. I tried to look back at the cab, more out of instinct than practicality, but it didn't matter anymore. They weren't interested in me as their main target. I had only blocked their path, and even then it was enough to prevent them from letting me walk away. They did nothing at the time except keep me there, controlled, without rushing, as if time wasn't a problem for them. They took away anything I could use, left me sitting near the side of the house, always with someone nearby but without unnecessary contact. Nobody explained anything, nobody threatened me directly. They just made it clear through their behavior that leaving wasn't up to me. The truck was still visible in the background, parked where I had left it, as if it belonged to someone else. And the night went on, too normal for a place where that was happening. At some point, I couldn't quite pinpoint it, they put me back in motion but not in the truck. They took me in another vehicle without conversation, without information, just movement. The road reappeared after a few minutes, but it wasn't the same point where I had entered, nor close enough for a clear reference. When they left me, it was quick, without goodbye, without looking back, just the door opening and closing. The sound of the vehicle disappeared in seconds, and only the silence of the empty road remained. And there I was, already out of their reach, but not out of what had happened. I managed to get help later, returned to the starting point with support, but the truck was no longer there, nor any sign of what had been done to it beyond the bare minimum that remained. A report came later, an investigation too, but little was concretely concluded. I kept driving because stopping doesn't solve anything, but I never again followed a route without first checking where it actually led. It's not about trusting or not trusting the GPS. It's about understanding that sometimes it's not leading you astray. It's taking you exactly where someone wants you to go. That's all for today. If you made it this far, thank you for sticking around. Before you head out, please leave a comment with your location and the current time. I read through these to see who else is awake in the quiet hours, and it's the best way to help the channel grow. It tells the algorithm that our community is active, which helps YouTube push these stories to new listeners. A quick like on your way out is always appreciated too. Stay safe, and I'll see you in the next one.